My husband stood across the courtroom, straightened his tie, and told the judge that I had never contributed anything meaningful to our 41 years together. Then the doors opened. His accountant, Rosalind Marsh, walked in. Carrying a briefcase I recognized immediately, the same briefcase I had seen sitting on our kitchen table the night she and my husband thought I was asleep. The color left his face so completely that even his lawyer leaned over to check on him. I had spent the previous 8 months believing Rosalind was the reason my marriage had ended. I had been wrong about nearly everything. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you something. Have you ever given the best years of your life to someone, only to watch them rewrite that history as though you never existed? If so, I hope this story finds you at the right moment. Please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Warm Heart Stories if stories like this one speak to you. Leave a comment telling me where you are watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one. I always have. My name is June Hartwell, and I am 63 years old. I am telling you this story from a small house in Kelowna, British Columbia, with a cup of tea going cold beside me and the Okanagan Lake visible through my kitchen window. A year ago, I could not have imagined sitting here peacefully. A year ago, I was still sleeping in a house that no longer felt like mine, beside a man I no longer recognized. I met my husband, Howard Hartwell, at a church potluck in Saskatoon in the autumn of 1983. I was 22 years old. He was 27. Howard was not wealthy. He drove a truck with rust along the wheel wells, wore the same brown jacket every weekend, and talked about the future the way only people who have very little tend to, with enormous, almost reckless hope. I found that beautiful about him. I still do when I think about who he was. I worked as a bookkeeper for a small veterinary practice on the edge of the city. It was not glamorous work. The pay was modest. But I was good at it. Numbers made sense to me in a way that other things sometimes did not. I could look at a column of figures and understand immediately where the problem lived. Howard wanted to open a property management company. He had been saving for years, small amounts, carefully set aside from his work as a building superintendent. He had notebooks full of calculations, projections, ideas. The first evening he spread them across my kitchen table and walked me through everything. I sat very still and listened. When he finished, he looked at me with that particular expression he had back then, hopeful and terrified in equal measure. "We don't quite have enough," he said. "I know," I told him. "But we're close." We were married the following spring. 6 months after our wedding, I co-signed the business loan. My credit history, my savings account, my professional record, all of it went onto those documents alongside his names. If the company had failed, the bank would have come for me first. Howard knew that. He thanked me every day for a week. The early years were genuinely hard. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in a building Howard managed as part of his arrangement with the original owner. Our son, Philip, was born 14 months after our wedding. The 3 of us shared a space that felt smaller every season. I continued working at the veterinary practice full-time, while also managing the young company's bookkeeping in the evenings. Howard would come home from site visits with mud on his boots and exhaustion behind his eyes, eat whatever I had managed to put together, and then sit beside me at the table going through invoices until 10 or 11 at night. I am not telling you this to create sympathy. I am telling you this because what came later can only be understood against this background. You cannot understand the betrayal without first understanding what was built, and by whom. The company grew. Slowly at first, then with real momentum. Howard had a talent for managing properties that I had always recognized. He was organized, fair with tenants, reliable with owners. His reputation spread through word of mouth in the way that only genuine quality can. By the time Philip was in elementary school, Hartwell Property Management had 12 contracts across Saskatchewan. By the time Philip started high school, we had relocated to Calgary and the company employed 23 people. I had left the veterinary practice by then. Howard needed me full-time in the business. I handled all financial operations, payroll, accounts receivable, tax filings, banking relationships, insurance renewals. I sat across from auditors and bank managers and explained our numbers with the same calm I had always brought to figures. Howard focused on client relationships and operations. We divided the company between us as naturally as we divided everything else. I remember one particular evening in our Calgary house. Philip was 17, already talking about university. Howard and I were sitting on the back deck after dinner, watching the light change over the mountains. He reached across and took my hand without saying anything. After a while, he said, "I could not have done any of this without you." I believed him completely. I filed that memory away carefully. I returned to it for years afterward whenever things became difficult. I should have noticed the changes sooner. The truth is that I did notice them. I simply chose explanations that hurt less. Howard joined a business association, then a golf club, then a charitable board whose dinners he attended without me, first occasionally, then every week. He began talking about people I had never met, using the particular warmth he reserved for things he considered important. He started wearing suits I did not recognize. When I mentioned them, he said it was important to present well at the level the company had reached. I agreed with him, because he was right. That was the difficult part. He was always slightly right, just enough to make questioning him feel unreasonable. The comments began around that same time. Small ones, quiet ones, the kind that leave no obvious wound but accumulate over months into something that changes how you carry yourself. You might want to update that jacket, June. You don't need to come to this one. It's mostly industry people. I think they want to discuss some things. I'll fill you in afterward. I told myself he was protecting me from boredom. I told myself the company's social world had evolved beyond what I found comfortable. I told myself that after 40 years together, distance in one area did not mean distance in every area. Then I heard a name for the first time. Rosalind Marsh. She was a chartered professional accountant Howard had hired to handle the company's external audit relationship. He mentioned her the way he mentioned any employee, casually, practically, briefly. Rosalind restructured the audit timeline. Rosalind suggested a new tax position. Rosalind caught a reporting inconsistency that saved us considerably. I noticed the name more than the content, but I pushed the noticing aside. Our 41st anniversary arrived in June. I made a reservation at a restaurant on the Elbow River, where we had celebrated our 30th. It was a place with particular meaning. Low lighting, good food, a view of the water that made everything feel possible. I told Howard 3 weeks in advance. He said it sounded lovely. The evening itself was almost unbearable. He arrived distracted and remained that way. His phone lived face up on the table, despite the restaurant's request. Twice he smiled at messages, the way people smile at things they actually care about. When I tried to start a conversation about Philip, or about a trip I had been thinking about, he answered in the monosyllabic way of someone waiting to be released from an obligation. I finally asked him directly whether something was wrong. He set down his wine. He looked at me with an expression I had not seen before, not unkind, precisely, but absent. The way you look at something you are already finished with. "June," he said, "I think you've been comfortable for a long time. I think that's made you stop growing." I asked him what he meant. He looked around the restaurant. He said that the company operated at a level now. He said that required a certain kind of partner. He said that the people he worked with expected a particular presence. He said it carefully, politely, the way people deliver sentences they have rehearsed. Then he said the thing that I have never been able to forget. The truth is that at this stage, almost anyone could fill your role. The restaurant was not silent. There was music and conversation on every side of us. But I stopped hearing any of it. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I looked at him for a long moment, and then I set my napkin on the table, stood up, and left. The following week, the divorce papers arrived by courier. 41 years. 11 days. My son Philip called that same evening. I hoped, in the way that mothers always hope, that he was calling to sit with me in the difficulty of what had happened. Instead, he said something I was not prepared for. "Mum, I know this is really hard, but Dad has put a lot into this company. I think maybe you should think carefully before you fight it." I asked him what he meant by fight it. He said the company was primarily Dad's vision. I sat very still on my end of the line. Then I asked him who had signed the original loan documents. He was quiet. Then he said, "I know you helped in the early years." Helped. I ended the conversation shortly afterward. Then I sat alone in the kitchen of the house we had bought when Philip started high school. The house where I had done 30 years of company bookkeeping on a desk in the corner of the bedroom. And I understood for the first time that I had not simply lost a husband. I had lost the story of my own life, or someone was trying very hard to take it from me. I called a lawyer the next morning. Her name was Adrienne Cole, and a colleague had recommended her with the particular emphasis people use when they mean someone genuinely good. Adrienne did not rush me. She asked questions and listened to the answers. When I described the early years of the company, the loan, the bookkeeping, the dual role I had played for 4 decades, she became noticeably attentive. "Do you still have documentation from the original loan?" she asked. I told her I had everything. "Good," she said, "because your husband's version of events may have a significant problem." I went to the basement storage room the following day. I had not been in there properly in years. It was the kind of space that accumulates a marriage: hockey equipment, old school projects, boxes of Christmas decorations, photograph albums, and somewhere among all of it, the paper record of 40 years of a company that currently employed 31 people and managed property portfolios across 3 provinces. I started with the filing cabinets. By mid-afternoon, I had 4 separate piles on the concrete floor. Original loan documents, early financial statements, payroll records in my own handwriting, client correspondence I had prepared. Each folder was a piece of the argument Howard was trying to deny. Then I found the letter. It was near the bottom of a box marked business. Early years, tucked inside a folder of bank statements from the company's 2nd year. Howard had written it during a period when a large client had threatened to leave, and we had genuinely not known whether the company would survive the loss. I remembered that winter clearly. Philip had been 4 years old. I had spent 3 weeks restructuring our cash flow projections while working full-time and managing a toddler who had decided that January was the right time to stop sleeping. The letter was in Howard's handwriting. It said, "June, I don't know how we get through this without you. You hold all of this together when I can't see straight. Whatever happens to the company, it belongs to both of us. I love you." I sat on the cold basement floor and read it 4 times. Then I put it in the folder that Adrienne Cole was definitely going to see. Over the following weeks, I continued searching. What I found in the later records began to trouble me for reasons that had nothing to do with the divorce itself. Certain folders were missing from an inventory list I found in the same box. Not misplaced, absent. Someone had removed them deliberately. The pattern of what was gone was too specific to be accidental. I sent copies of everything to Adrienne. 2 days later, she called me. "June," she said, "where exactly did you find the later financial statements?" I described the boxes. A pause. Then, "Some of these transfers need a much closer look. I'm not making a claim yet, but I think there may be assets that haven't been properly disclosed." I stood at my kitchen window, looking out at the street. Howard and I had walked down every Sunday morning for 30 years, and I understood that what was happening was larger than a husband trying to leave a wife. Someone had been planning this. Not impulsively. Not recently. For a long time. That night I sat at the kitchen table and spread everything out again. Transfer records, missing folders, inexplicable payments to names I could not place. By midnight, a shape had emerged in the documents that made my chest go tight. Money had been moving in patterns that had nothing to do with ordinary company operations. And it had started approximately 16 months before Howard had told me, at an anniversary dinner on the Elbow River, that anyone could fill my role. He had been preparing long before he told me it was over. 3 weeks after Adrienne flagged the financial irregularities, my phone rang from a number I did not recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me answer. "Mrs. Hartwell?" The voice was careful, almost hesitant. "Yes." A pause. "My name is Rosalind Marsh." I did not speak for several seconds. Of all the people I had imagined calling me, Howard's accountant was not among them. "I know this is probably not a call you wanted to receive," she said. "But I think there are things you don't know, and I think you need to know them." I asked her why she was telling me this. She said, "Because I should have said something sooner." The guilt in those words sounded real. Not performed, not strategic. Real. We met at a coffee shop in a part of Calgary I had never had reason to visit. She was already there when I arrived. I recognized her from the company Christmas photograph I had seen 3 years ago. Younger than I had expected. Professionally dressed, with the kind of exhaustion behind her eyes that comes from carrying something heavy for too long. She stood when I approached. I sat down. I said, "Let's skip the introduction. Are you having an affair with my husband?" She looked genuinely startled. Then she shook her head. "No." The answer came without calculation. I studied her face. "Then why?" I asked. "Did your name appear in every conversation he had for the past 3 years?" She set her hands flat on the table. "Because I was useful to him." She paused. "And because he needed people looking at me instead of what he was actually doing." The coffee shop became very quiet around me. Rosalind explained slowly, carefully. She had been hired as an external auditor. Her relationship with Howard had always been professional. But Howard had understood something quickly, that a younger woman's name appearing in his communications, in office conversations, at events, would draw attention away from other things. He never corrected rumors. He occasionally encouraged them. As long as people were talking about Rosalind, they were not asking about the accounts. Including me. I had blamed her for 8 months. I had lain awake imagining the worst about a woman who had apparently spent those same 8 months trying to decide whether telling the truth was worth the risk to her career and her safety. She reached into her bag and removed a folder. Inside were printed records I recognized as similar to what Adrian had flagged, but more detailed. Much more detailed. "How did you get these?" I asked. "Some of them I processed," she said, not knowing what they were at first. Then she described the same pattern of compartmentalized responsibilities that had made it difficult for any single person to see the complete picture. Until, 18 months earlier, a filing error had routed a batch of documents to her desk that were never meant to arrive there. She had spent 18 months being afraid. Then she told me about that anniversary dinner. She had been at the same restaurant that evening, a client dinner, a coincidence she had not planned. She had overheard Howard's voice from 2 tables away. She had heard the words clearly. At this stage, almost anyone could fill your role. Her voice cracked slightly when she repeated them. I sat very still. "He wasn't even ashamed," she said quietly. She placed a flash drive on the table between us. "What is that?" I asked. "Insurance." Her voice was steady. "In case something happens to me, I want you to have a copy." I looked at her across the table and understood that she was genuinely frightened. Not of losing her position, of something more serious than that. Before we left, she said, "There's one thing you still don't know. The financial irregularities, they don't end with Howard." I asked her what she meant. She said, "There's someone else." She would not say the name in the coffee shop. She said she would tell me in court. I barely slept for the next 2 weeks. The flash drive went to Adrian immediately. Her expression when she reviewed the contents was the expression of someone who has just seen something that changes the shape of the entire case. She requested a forensic accountant. Within days, undisclosed accounts began surfacing. A pattern of transfers to a name neither of us recognized, Colette Warren. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Thursday. On the Wednesday evening, Rosalind stopped responding to messages. I called repeatedly. Nothing. Adrian called. Nothing. I sat in my kitchen through most of that night, watching my phone and trying not to imagine the worst. Then at nearly midnight, an envelope appeared in my mailbox. No stamp. No return address. Inside, a flash drive and a handwritten note with 2 words. Everything. Twice. I called Adrian immediately. She arrived within 20 minutes. We reviewed the drive together at my kitchen table. It contained duplicates of everything Rosalind had already produced, plus additional records. Accounts, transfer histories, and something neither of us had seen before. A series of communications between Howard and an individual connected to 3 numbered corporations registered in Alberta. The picture was no longer unclear. The hearing began at 10 in the morning. Howard arrived with his lawyer, a man named Sterling Okafor, whose suits cost more than most people's monthly rent and whose confidence suggested he was not accustomed to being surprised. Howard looked relaxed. He looked like a man who had already decided how this would end. Our eyes met briefly as I took my seat. He gave me the faint, almost pitying smile of someone who believes they are watching. "You make a mistake they will not bother to prevent." Adrian presented our initial arguments with the patience and precision of someone who does not need volume to be heard. The loan documents appeared on the screen at the front of the courtroom. My signature, clear on every critical page. My name alongside his on the agreement that had made the company possible, the early financial records. payroll ledgers in my handwriting, client correspondence from the first 3 years when I had been, in practical terms, the entire administrative structure of the company. Howard's expression changed incrementally, never dramatically. Just enough. Sterling Okafor objected regularly, efficiently, professionally. But the documents were what they were. Then Adrian introduced the financial irregularities. Carefully, methodically. Questions about disclosure. Questions about transfers. Questions about accounts. The judge, a woman named Honorable Patricia Gould, asked Howard directly whether all financial accounts had been disclosed. Yes, Howard said, immediately, without hesitation. I recognized the speed of the answer. I had spent 41 years learning how Howard answered questions he was comfortable with and questions he was not. That answer came too fast. Adrian recognized it too, but Rosalind was still missing, and by the afternoon recess, her absence had become a specific kind of dread in my chest that I could not reason away. Then, 30 minutes after the recess ended, the courtroom doors opened. Rosalind Marsh walked in. She looked exhausted. She looked like someone who had not slept properly and had made a decision that frightened her deeply and had decided to honor it anyway. She walked to the front of the courtroom with the particular steadiness of someone who has stopped being afraid of the thing they were afraid of, because they have decided the truth is more important. Howard's face went completely still. I watched it happen. Every practiced expression disappeared. What remained underneath was not composed. Adrian called Rosalind to the stand. The questioning began quietly. Professional history, her role with the company, the nature of her responsibilities. Rosalind answered each question with the flat clarity of someone reading from a document she has memorized, because she has looked at it every day for 18 months. Then Adrian introduced the records. The courtroom followed the documentation with the particular attention of people who are watching something they expected to be complicated become very simple. Transfer after transfer, account after account. Payments routed through numbered corporations to a single ultimate recipient, Colette Warren. Sterling Okafor objected. Honorable Gould allowed the testimony to continue. Adrian asked, "Can you describe the nature of these transfers?" Rosalind answered without looking at Howard. The funds were drawn from accounts connected to company operations and redirected through a series of corporate structures to personal accounts in the name of Colette Warren. The amounts were substantial. The timeline stretched back nearly 3 years. A murmur moved through the courtroom. Adrian asked, "How did you first become aware of Colette Warren?" "Through Howard," Rosalind said. He discussed her frequently. He spoke about her as though she represented a version of his life he had decided he preferred. She paused. Then she said, "He was proud of her." I closed my eyes for a moment. Adrian asked, "Was there another person in this room who was aware of Colette Warren prior to these proceedings?" Rosalind looked toward the observers' seats. My son Philip sat there beside his wife, Vanessa. Vanessa's expression, when the question was asked, changed in a way that had nothing to do with surprise. She already knew the name. Adrian turned. "Mrs. Hartwell," she was addressing Vanessa. "Are you acquainted with Colette Warren?" Philip turned to look at his wife. The expression on his face was the expression of someone who has just understood something he had been refusing to understand. Vanessa was quiet for too long. Then she said very quietly, "Yes." The courtroom did not erupt. It simply became extremely still. "How long have you known her?" Adrian asked. "About 2 years, Vanessa said. I looked at my son. Philip was staring at the floor. He had not looked at me since Rosalind began testifying. I thought about the phone call. "I know you helped in the early years, and I understood that what hurt most was not Howard's betrayal. Howard had changed into something I no longer recognized. But Philip had been raised in our house. He had sat beside me at that basement table doing his homework while I organized company records late into the night. He knew what I had done. He had always known. His silence had been a choice." Adrian then produced the recordings. The same ones Rosalind had played for me at the coffee shop. The courtroom speakers carried Howard's voice clearly, without distortion. The words landed in the room the way things land when everyone hears them at the same moment. Honestly, at this point, any competent person could walk in and do what June does. She's been running on momentum for 20 years. No one moved. Then the recording continued, and someone else's voice asked, "What about the loan she signed?" Howard laughed. The sound filled the courtroom. "Banks love co-signers," he said. "It doesn't mean she built anything." I sat very still in my chair. Adrian let the silence hold for a moment. Then she rested her case for the day. The following morning, I took the stand. I was not nervous. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect a woman in her 60s, sitting in a courtroom after 41 years of marriage, to be shaking. I was not shaking. I had spent the previous evening sitting at my kitchen table, reviewing everything I intended to say, and by the time I finished, I understood that I was not angry anymore. I was simply ready. Adrian guided me through the early years of the company, with the patience of someone who understands that a life must be told in order, because order is where meaning lives. I described the loan. I described the nights at the kitchen table when Philip was small. I described the payroll periods when cash flow was tight, and I had restructured our personal finances to cover the gap without telling Howard. Because I did not want to add to his stress. I described the audit I had prepared for entirely on my own, when Howard was managing a crisis with a major client in Regina and could not come home for 6 days. Adrian held up the letter. She asked the court's permission to read it aloud. "Whatever happens to the company, it belongs to both of us." Howard stared at the floor. Then Sterling Okafor stood for cross-examination. He was careful, professional. He established that Howard had managed the client relationships, that Howard had driven the company's strategic growth, that Howard had, in many meaningful respects, been the public face of Hartwell Property Management for 4 decades. I agreed with each point, because each point was true. Then he asked, "So wouldn't you say that the company's success was primarily your husband's achievement?" I looked at him steadily. "No," I said. He seemed to expect that. He said, "Why not?" I answered him the way I had answered questions my entire professional life. Clearly, without embellishment, with the particular confidence of someone who is describing something they know to be accurate. Because the company existed because I signed for it. It survived its worst years because I managed its finances through crises that Howard never fully saw. It grew because 2 people were doing the work of 4, and only one of us had a title. Howard built the client relationships. Howard drove the growth. Howard is a talented man, and none of that changes the fact that a company is not built by vision alone. It is built by the daily invisible work that nobody photographs or applauds or mentions in the annual report. The courtroom was quiet. I said, "Howard wants credit for everything that succeeded. I understand that impulse. But a partnership does not work that way, and neither does a marriage. You do not get to accept the sacrifice for 41 years and then act, at the end, as though it never happened." Sterling Okafor sat down. The ruling came the following week. Honorable Patricia Gould's voice was measured and calm in the way of someone who has considered everything carefully and arrived somewhere with confidence. She acknowledged the evidence of the co-signed loan. She acknowledged the documented financial contributions over 4 decades. She acknowledged the payroll records, the correspondence, the audit history, the letter. She stated that the company had not been built by one person, and that the financial settlement would reflect that reality. She also noted, with particular deliberateness, that the evidence presented raised serious concerns about the accuracy of the financial disclosures filed at the beginning of proceedings. She directed that the matter of undisclosed assets and transfers to third-party accounts be referred for further review. Howard's face, when she said that, was the face of a man who has just understood that the thing he was protecting is no longer protected. After the courtroom cleared, I found Rosalind standing in the corridor outside. She was leaning against the wall with her eyes closed. When she heard me approach, she opened them, and I saw how tired she was, not just from the day but from the long months before it. I stood in front of her. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then I said, "I owe you an apology." She shook her head. "No," I said. "I spent 8 months thinking the worst about you. You spent those same months trying to find the courage to do the right thing. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand which of us was actually wrong." Her eyes filled. She looked away toward the window at the end of the corridor. "I don't know what happens to my career after this," she said. I said, "I don't know either. But what you did today was the most honest thing anyone has done in my life in a very long time." She nodded. Then she said something quietly, almost to herself. I kept thinking, somebody should have said something sooner. I just didn't want it to have to be me. I understood that feeling. I had felt it myself about different things for years. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, Philip drove to Kelowna. He sat in my kitchen for almost 20 minutes before he said anything. I made tea and waited. Outside the window, the lake was very still. Finally, he said, I knew more than I told you. I knew it before the hearing. I didn't know everything, but I knew enough that I should have said something, and I didn't. I asked him why. He said he had told himself it was complicated, that he was trying to be fair to both sides, that he did not want to be in the middle. I said, there was no middle, Philip. There was the truth, and there was silence. He did not argue. He sat with that for a while. I told him that I forgave him, because I did, not because it was ishy, and not because everything was repaired, but because carrying that particular weight was not something I was willing to do for the rest of my life. Forgiveness, I have learned, is not the same as forgetting. It is simply the decision to stop letting someone else's choices determine the size of your own life. We have been rebuilding, slowly. Some conversations are still difficult. Some probably will be for a long time. But he is my son, and I am his mother, and that fact survived even the things that should have broken it. I sold the Calgary house in the spring. The decision surprised people who knew how hard I had fought for it. But standing inside it after the movers had taken everything out, I understood that the house had been a symbol I needed to protect, not a place I needed to live. I had won what the house represented. I did not need the rooms themselves. The Kelowna house is smaller and entirely mine. I chose everything in it. I painted the kitchen a color called Morning Fog that I found in a sample book while standing in a hardware store on a Tuesday afternoon, alone, making a decision that depended on no one else's opinion. I hung on the photographs I wanted to hang. I left the walls bare in the places where something is still deciding what it wants to be. The idea for what came next arrived gradually, the way most good ideas do, not as a sudden realization, but as a slow accumulation of conversations. I had been in contact with Adrienne Cole about the final details of the settlement, when she mentioned that she regularly saw women in similar situations who had no financial documentation of their contributions to a family business. No records. No proof. Women who had done exactly what I had done, but had never thought to keep the evidence. Because, why would you keep evidence against a life you trusted? I spent 3 months talking to women through community organizations and legal aid offices. Then I partnered with a retired judge and 2 accountants, one of whom was Rosalind Marsh, to develop a simple financial literacy program specifically for women who co-own or significantly contribute to a family business without formal recognition. We called it the Foundation Record. We offered the first workshops in Kelowna in the early autumn. 12 women attended. By the 3rd session, 27. The conversations in those rooms were the most honest conversations I had participated in since I sat across from Rosalind in that Calgary coffee shop and understood that people sometimes tell the truth even when it costs them something. Rosalind runs the financial documentation component of the program now. She presents with a directness and warmth that I did not see in her at the beginning, when she was still frightened. It is something, I think, that was always there but required a particular kind of difficulty to bring forward. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Howard's financial situation had become considerably more complicated. The referral that Honorable Gould made had led to an investigation that was, by all accounts, ongoing. I did not follow the details closely. That chapter had ended for me before the ink was dry on the settlement agreement, and whatever consequences were still unfolding for Howard were the natural result of decisions he had made, not things I had done to him. One afternoon in early December, I was locking up the community room we used for our workshops when I stood for a moment in the empty space and thought about the anniversary dinner, the restaurant on the Elbow River, the particular quality of Howard's voice when he said what he said. At this stage, almost anyone could fill your role. I stood in that community room and I understood, finally, what had actually happened. He had meant to diminish me. He had meant to make me feel replaceable. What he had actually done was clarify something I had needed to understand for years, that the life I had been living was considerably smaller than the life I was capable of. The woman who had built a company from a kitchen table with a toddler underfoot while working full-time. That woman was still entirely present. She had simply been waiting for enough space to move. I turned off the light. I locked the door. I walked out to my car in the dark, with the particular feeling of someone who knows exactly where they are going. If you are watching this from somewhere in Canada, from a cold city or a small town, or a house where things are not what you thought they were, I want you to hear this. The years you have given to someone else's dream are not wasted. The invisible work was real work. The sacrifices were real sacrifices. And the person who failed to see your value was the one with the limited vision, not you. Have you ever had to fight to have your own story recognized? Have you ever given everything and had someone act as though you gave nothing? Leave your comment below. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I find such comfort in knowing how far these stories travel, and I read every word. Thank you for being here. Your presence on this channel means more than I know how to say. And remember, your worth does not diminish because someone stopped looking.